Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll get started. So I want to talk about the connection between Parshat Tzav and Shabbat HaGadol. Now, there really is no connection. The fact that we read Parshat Tzav on Shabbat HaGadol is merely coincidental. We'll see. In other words, there's certain weeks of the year that we have to read certain, Parshat. Tzav in this, we only read it because it's a non-leap year. In a leap year, we're going to read Mitzorah or, generally. So I just want to show you one source. I'm going to share my screen a little bit for a second. And then we'll take a look at a kind of interesting source here. Everybody can see. Oh boy, okay. All right, so the Gemara says, Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Ezra Tikein Lim Yisrael Shiu Korim Klalot Shabbat Torah Kohanim Kodem Atzeret Shav Mishnah Torah Kodem Rosh Hashanah. So Ezra made a takana. Ezra made a decree that we should read the curses in the Torah in Vayikra before Atzeret. Atzeret meaning on Shavuot, and we should read the ones in Mishnah Torah in Kitavo. We should read them before Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara says, why is sort of a famous reason? Amar Abaye, Viteme Reish Lakish, Kadesh Tichla Shana V'Kilaloteha, in order that the year should end and its curses. So the Gemara says, Bishlama Sheba Mishnah Torah, Ika Kadesh Yichla Shana V'Kilaloteha. So I understand at Kitavo, we read it in September. We read it the week before Rosh Hashanah. That's the year should come to an end. We actually don't read it the week before Rosh Hashanah. We read it actually 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. That's the way we've set up our calendar. Tosfot points out we don't want to sort of have right before Rosh Hashanah talking on the curses. But the Gemara wants to know, what about the ones in Vayikra? How do you say that Shavuot is a Rosh Hashanah? That can't be. So the Gemara says, in Atzeret Nami Rosh Hashanah he ditnan, but Atzeret al Per de Ilan. So the Gemara says that Shavuot is also has a status of Rosh Hashanah. Why does it have a status of Rosh Hashanah? Because it's one of the days of judgment of the year. So that's a very fascinating comment. We know the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us that there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs during the year. Shavuos is not one of them. The first of Nisan is one of them. The first of Elul, the first of Tishrei, and Tu B'Shvat. Those are the 4 Rosh Hashanahs. But it's very interesting. The Gemara says that because it's a day of judgment, each one of the Yamim Tovim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot is a day of judgment. Rosh Hashanah is a major day of judgment. That's when we're all judged. But on Pesach, the Mishnah tells us we're judged how much wheat, how successful our wheat harvest is going to be. On Shavuot, Peirot HaIlan, our fruits, and on Sukkot, our water. So these are all days of judgment. The Mishnah considers that New Year. So that's the basis, just to point out that occasionally we have to read things at certain times of the year. Remember, when the Parshat Shavua come much later, and they would probably just arrange their calendar, just read it extra like we do on the 4 weeks leading up to Pesach. So we add a special maftir. What's interesting is on Shabbat HaGadol, we spoke about this briefly last night, Shabbat HaGadol, even though there's no special maftir, it's just a regular week, just whatever the parsha happens to be, we have a special haftorah. That's very unusual because usually the haftorah is linked to the parsha, but here we have a special haftorah without a special maftir. Just very briefly, probably the most famous other, reading that has to be at a certain time of year besides the klalot, the tocha before Rosh Hashanah and Shavuot, and the Dalit Parshiyot is the Gemara. We say, tsumo utzlu. We should fast and daven. So that's a reference to on Tisha B'Av. We fast on Tisha B'Av and then we pray. We should, the Moshe Rabbeinu cried out to God that he wants to enter in the land of Israel. And it's really Parshat Vatchanan after Tisha B'Av. You'll hear a lot of rabbis will give a whole speech why we read Dvarim before Tisha B'Av. So there are connections, the Meraglim, many connections. Eicha, Esa, Levadi, how can I take your burdens? But it's really Parshat Vatchanan that is supposed to be read after Tisha B'Av. Anyway, we read the way our calendar works coincidentally. So we read generally the story, always read the story of Yosef, usually Parshat Miketz, on Hanukkah time. And like I said, Parshat Tzav, when it's a non-leap year, we're going to read that on Shabbat HaGadol. So before we get to the main topic, which is really the Corvantoda that I want to talk about, I just want to mention a few very sort of incidental or coincidental ties into the Parsha, into Pesach. So the Parsha begins Tzav, that God spoke to Moshe, command Tzav. We talk on the Trumat Hadeshen, with the cleaning of the ashes of the temple. That's how the Parsha begins, that the first mitzvah that was done every day in the Beit HaMikdash was the Trumat Hadeshen, which is, first of all, the name is very interesting. Truma means to raise up. The raising up of the ashes. The laws was that all the sacrifices, they would sacrifice them, and then the fats would burn all night on the temple, on the altar. And then at 4 o'clock in the morning, before dawn, before Amud HaShachar, they would clean out the altar to get ready for the next day. And this was the first mitzvah in the Torah. It's not just, in other words, to be basically, I don't know how to phrase it, but to be a janitor, to be the person who cleans up the shul. The Torah puts it into a big deal, and it makes it into a mitzvah, the Trumat Hadeshen, leharim, and it means to lift up. It's not just to remove. When you clean up the Beit HaMikdash and you clean up a shul, you clean up a school, you're raising it up. So that's the mitzvah of Trumat Hadeshen, of course, the whole idea of cleaning, but of course is very much tied into Pesach. But really, the word Tzav. So Rashi points out, what does the word Tzav mean? So Tzav is a command, but Rashi says whenever the Torah uses the word Tzav, it means lizarez, to encourage us to act quickly. Zrizim makdimim mitzvah, to do it right away at the first opportunity. And of course, that's a very common theme on Pesach, our zrizut, how quickly we have to be, how quickly we have to make the matzah and everything. That's we'll get to later on the Corvantoda. So that's one sort of, not exactly why we read on before Pesach, but a little tie-in to Pesach. Also very interesting, by the way, is in this parsha we have the mitzvah of Hagalat Kelim. How do you make vessels kosher, non-kosher vessels? So this actually appears twice in the Torah. It appears here and in Parshat Matwat, I believe. Matwat, after the war with Midian in the 40th year. So when they came back, they had gathered all the pots and pans of the Midianite people. So the Torah tells us, how do you take non-kosher pots and make it into kosher pots and pans? What's actually quite interesting, if the laws of kashrut are in Yoredeya, in the section of Shulchan Aruch, and yet many of the laws of how to kasher kelim are on Hilchot Pesach. If you look in Hilchot Pesach, in Orach Chaim, the day-to-day life, that's where they put a lot of the laws of how do we make vessels kosher, because that's the common time that it was done. Okay, but what I want to talk about, just I guess one more thing I'll mention on Trumat Hadeshen, which is the danger of extremism. You know, religion's excitement, which is what it means. Zerizut, to be zariz, means I'm excited to do a mitzvah. I'm going to do the mitzvah at the first opportunity. We derived that from Avraham Avinu. They got up early in the morning, so we're always excited. But if people are too excited to do mitzvot, it can sometimes be problematic. If there's a sort of the line between fanaticism and extremism and deep religious yearning is sometimes a fine line, and sometimes we cross it at our peril. The Mishnah describes that they used to clean up the altar at before dawn. It's literally at 4 o'clock in the morning. So what used to happen? Who wants to get up at 4 in the morning to do this work? So whatever Kohen wants to get up in the morning, we'll let him do it. The Mishnah says that actually there were lots of Kohanim who wanted to do it because they considered it a great mitzvah. So they used to have a race, like in the Olympics. They would take a race, and whoever got to the altar first won. Now, in the Beit HaMikdash, the altar was basically 9 amot tall. So even if you take the least amount, for an amah means the difference between the elbow and the middle finger. So it's somewhere between 18 and 24 inches. So even if you assume it's 18 inches, and if you assume 9 amot, that's like 13 and a half feet. So the Mishnah says once they had a race, and it was like a tie, or maybe one guy won in a photo finish. And so the guy who lost was very upset, so he pushed them off the ramp. He pushed and it wasn't so good. So the rabbis saw how dangerous this was. So the rabbis instituted they're going to have a lottery to do this every day. And then they were afraid people would actually cheat on the lottery. They would put out their fingers, like people would say, okay, everybody, they'll throw it, there are 10 Kohanim there. Everybody put up fingers, 1 or 2, and then you count the number 28 and count the fingers. So you weren't allowed to put out a thumb because you could, hide that at the last minute as you're singing it. Very interesting, people cheating and all this stuff that goes on. Ostensibly because they want to do a religious practice. It's kind of ironic and sad and tragic, but very human. That's the way we human beings are. So the Trumat Hadesha, which is how the Parsha begins, and Rashi said Tzav, do it quickly with excitement. You have to be careful not to cross the bounds of excitement. Okay, but what I want to talk about is the Corvantoda, the Thanksgiving offering. We know tomorrow morning we will say Korban. We will say Mizmor L'Toda. It's really every day in the davening. We say Mizmor L'Toda. We thank God from Tehillim. And the Gemara says there are 4 specific things we have to bring a Korban Toda, or what we today say Birkat HaGomel, if you cross the sea, if you were sick, etc. So the Korban Toda is so fundamental, the notion of gratitude, that it got put into our Siddur, basically. And as we'll see in a moment, generally we don't say it on Erev Pesach, but let's take a look at how the Torah introduces the Korban Toda. So the Torah says, Zot Torah Zevach HaShlamim Asher Yekriv L'Hashem. Everybody can see this, I hope. This is the law. By the way, the word Torah here, which is used over and over again in Parshat Tzav, means here they translate this is the ritual. Okay, these are the rules, not like the Torah Zevach HaShlamim. This is the rule of the Shlamim Asher Yakriv L'Hashem, that you should sacrifice. If you're bringing a Thanksgiving offering, so you have to have chalot matzot. You got to have matzah chala. It can be matzah or chametz. Chalot matzot belulot b'shemen in oil. Rikikei matzot, thinner wafers. The chalot are thicker wafers. Rikikei matzot meshukim b'shemen. V'solet murvechet chalot belulot b'shemen, and the different flour mixed with oil, and it has to be a chalot lechem chametz yakriv korbano. And you have to bring the Korban Toda with chametz. We're not talking on Pesach here. We're talking the whole year. Achalot lechem chametz yakriv korbano al zevach toda shlomav. So the Korban Toda we learned last week in Vayikra, that there are 5 korbanot. There are 5 types of sacrifices we bring. That's a Korban Olah. That's a burnt offering where 100% goes on the mizbeach, on the altar. Nobody eats anything. Then you have a Korban Mincha, which is the flour offering, which is eaten by the Kohanim and nobody else. The Kohanim eat you have to take a fistful and put a fistful of flour on the altar, and then the Kohen eats the rest. Then you have a Korban Shlamim, a peace offering, which is most of it is eaten by the person who brings it, and you can bring it because you want to give Thanksgiving, whatever. The Korban Toda is a form of a Shlamim. Then we have a Chatat, a sin offering. That's brought whenever you violate a sin that, had you done it on purpose, would carry the punishment of karet, of excision, and you did it accidentally. So eating chametz on Pesach, eating on Yom Kippur, violation of Shabbat, that was done accidentally, you would bring a sin offering. And then you have a korban hasham, which is a specific type, generally a sin offering, although it's brought by a mitzorah, and it's brought by a nazir also. But it's brought if a person steals something and he denies he stole it, and then he admits he stole it, etc. So there are 6 times you bring a korban hasham. It's kind of like a form of echatat. Those are the 5 korbanot we have. Then other korbanot are subsets of those korbanot. So the korban toda is a subset of a shlamim. The Korban Pesach, which we'll get to, the Korban Pesach is also, of course, a subset of a Korban Shlamim, a peace offering, a complete offering, where, like I said, mostly eaten by the person who brings it, and a little bit shared with the Kohen, and a little bit put on the altar. So the Torah tells us that when we bring a Korban Toda, we have to bring a mixture of matzah and chametz in it, and then the Mishnah describes you have to bring actually 40 loaves of bread. You have to bring 40 loaves of bread, and in the mitzvah. Now, so that's an exception to the rule, because if those remember last week. So last week we learned, the Torah told us, and it's repeated again in this week's parsha, but the Torah tells us, so whenever you bring a flour offering, a korban mincha, you're not allowed to bring it if it's made of chametz. 365 days a year, and there were at least 9 different types of korbanot mincha, 9 types of flour offering. Let's say a woman, if she gave birth, she couldn't afford to bring an animal offering, could bring a flour offering. It was brought many cases, sometimes by the poor and sometimes in January. This is the korban omer that we bring on Pesach, the second day of Pesach, and we start counting the Sfiras Omer. So that's a korban mincha. So whenever you bring a korban mincha, you can't have any chametz on it, because you're not allowed to have any leaven or dvash. Dvash is basically date honey. Dvash is date honey. Lo taktir mimenu ishel Hashem. Korban reshit takrivo tam Hashem. A korban reshit, the first offering, that you can be brought from chametz. That's so rabbis understood. What's korban reshit? So korban reshit is the bikurim, and also the shtei halechem, the 2 loaves of bread that were brought on Shavuot. We know Pesach, the first day of Pesach, the second day of Pesach, we begin to count the Sfirat HaOmer. And we count for 49 days. And then on day 50 is the holiday of Shavuot. And the holiday of Shavuot in the Torah has nothing to do with the receiving of the Torah. That's non-existent in the Torah. Torah has no interest when the Torah was given. The Torah doesn't care. Torah makes no big deal. And the Torah writes about it in Yitro, but it never tells us when it was, and the Torah doesn't make a holiday for when it was. In the Torah, the only aspect of Shavuot is you brought these 2 loaves of bread. The Omer was barley, the Shtei Halechem was wheat, and the Omer allowed people to eat the new grains that they had planted last year, what we call Chadash. When you plant grain, you're not allowed to eat it. If you plant grain, let's say in November, and you harvest it in March, so you can't eat it till they brought the Korban Omer. And then in the Beit HaMikdash, the Shtei Halechem allowed you to bring the new wheat in the temple. And that's the link. The Omer is the link between the Mincha offering on the second day of Pesach and the Mincha offering on the second day on Shavuot. And that korban was chametz, but no other korban mincha could be made of chametz, with, as we just saw, the exception of the Corvantoda, where you had 30 loaves of matzah and 10 loaves of chametz. Although it was this equal amounts of flour, but it was divided 30 and 10. Anybody want to give a suggestion why we cannot have chametz for a korban mincha? Any ideas why that might be so? Okay, so let's don't all answer at once. Let's take a look at the Sefer HaChinuch. So the Sefer HaChinuch, which is, I think, one of the most important books ever written. I also think it's the best overview of Judaism ever written. It's, as I'm sure many of you know, it's a compendium of the 613 mitzvot, which of course we don't have an exact list. We don't have an agreed upon list, but the list he uses, the list of the Rambam, 613 mitzvot. And the Sefer HaChinuch gives you a brief summary of each mitzvah, 2 or 3 pages or a page. And then he gives you the rationale for each mitzvah. What is the reason we have this mitzvah? And it's written in beautiful Hebrew. It's simple. It was written from a father to a son, because in Spain in the 13th century, anonymously, we don't know to this day exactly who wrote it. And the son was, I guess, more interested in philosophy, not so interested in Judaism. And the father was trying to show his son the beauty of the mitzvot of the Torah, the logic and the beauty of them. So it's always a go-to book. It's for, if you read Sefer HaChinuch, you'd have an overview of the entire Torah. You know a little bit about everything there is to know in the Torah, because it goes through all the mitzvot and it's not so long. Anyway, so the Sefer HaChinuch writes something I just think it's fascinating. Shorsh mitzvah zu ne'emlami mo'od limso afilu remes katan mehem. You know, I can't even find a little hint. I have no idea why the Torah tells us we can't have any chametz. I don't know. It's ne'elam. It's hidden from us. Ulam mipnei shekvar hodati b'ftichat dvari shekavanti be'elu tamim shani kotev largiv hanarim. I already wrote to you in the introduction that the reason I'm writing this book is so the children should get used to and understand the mitzvot, ulahatim lahem, and to literally taste them, that they should understand, that they should come to understand and to follow the laws of the Torah. The words of the Torah have reasons and benefit. Even if we don't understand, the laws of the Torah are not just abstract, that we have to follow the will of God. Each one of the mitzvot have a reason, and I don't really know what the reason is. But I'm going to have to give you, I'll tell you what I think might be the reason. And nobody should get upset at me. I'm telling you, I mean well. I'm doing it for the sake of heaven. I'm doing it so the kids should be observant. You don't like my reason, don't get too upset at me. So I find that just a fascinating idea of first of all, the statement of modesty and just a beautiful sort of introduction that he writes. So mind you, I think the reasons he gives are quite good. I don't think, like I said, I have no idea why. And then he gives a couple reasons. I think the reasons are not bad. So the first reason he does is that chametz symbolizes arrogance. This I'm sure most people have heard. Chametz symbolizes arrogance. Matzah symbolizes humility. Chametz rises. It represents and matzah is very flat, very mo'od. Be very lowly. So, arrogance has no place in the worship of God. Cannot worship God. Back, the Gemara in Sota tells us that when somebody's arrogant, God leaves the room, so to speak. And God said, there's not enough space here. This arrogant person takes up the whole room. There's no room for God. That's a very, the way the rabbis portray it. Basically, one who's arrogant puts God out of the way. I mean, in a totally separate realm, the reason we follow the opinions of Beit Hillel, not Beit Shammai, the Gemara says, is because Beit Hillel was more humble. Beit Shammai was not so humble. Not as humble. Beit Hillel would always quote the opinions of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai would never quote the opinions of Beit Hillel. So the Gemara says they were more humble. So we follow them. Somebody who's more humble is less likely to make a mistake. So that's the first reason the Sefer HaChinuch gives. The second reason the Sefer HaChinuch gives is that chametz is what we started earlier, is notion zrizut. In order to make matzah, you have to act really, really quickly. And when it comes to the worship of God, we gotta act fast. We gotta act fast in the everything what we do. And of course, that's what matzah is all about, and that's what all our service of God has to be. We cannot sit back and relax in the temple, so everything's got to be made of matzah. That's how the Sefer HaChinuch. But just I'll show you a little bit inside. As you mentioned, then that's what he talks about on the chametz, and then he adds, what about the prohibition of honey? Dvash or date honey, right? Dvash. It's very interesting what he says. That the reason the Torah tells us to go far away from honey, it's for the kids. I want that the kids should straighten them out, to give them muster, chastisement. people shouldn't run after pleasure. You shouldn't run after sweet fruits to your tongue. So those who like to get drunk and drink, etc., everything they want is sweet. Now, he's not saying you can't have nice food. That's not at all what he's saying. He's saying that you can't have, your goal in life shouldn't be to get more pleasure and more sweetness. I think Avraham Chorsky, of course, one of the many rabbis, unfortunately, who passed away this year. So Dr. Chorsky, I think, noted a few years ago, he made some comment that modern Orthodox Jews are up to their eyeballs in the seeking of pleasure. In other words, we have I don't have to tell you what goes on. Whether things will change because of COVID, I don't know. Whether the weddings will get toned down a little bit, the vacations, I don't know. But anyways, that's so it's a tricky balance. But what the Sefer HaChinuch says is the Torah tells us don't put any honey, don't put any sweetness in the korbanot, because we don't want your life to be like that. One could have argued the exact opposite, by the way. One could have argued you for sure want to put, because you want to show the Torah is sweet and Torah is beautiful. And, like I say, he says you can argue on him. You could argue that. It could be merely one of degree. I'm sure many of you know the old minhag was that they used to put honey on the aleph beit. When the kid was 3 years old and he went to cheder, so the teacher would put him on his lap and say aleph is sweet and Torah is sweet. I don't know. I never had that experience exactly, but that's what they do. The Torah is sweet, but the Sefer Chinuch is saying to put it in would be too much. So you have to find this balance between the Torah is sweet and we shouldn't run too much after pleasure. And that's a very hard balance to find. Okay, it's something we have to work on. So at least we should remind ourselves to know of that when we read. We don't have any korbanot today. When we read about what the korban has to be. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, he gives a similar idea, but I think a little different. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch explains that bread is the food of freedom, and matzah is the food of a slave. Halach manya. Well, we'll get to why we eat matzah at the Seder in a moment. It's a little bit weird. So bread is the food of freedom, and a person, we didn't become free when we left Egypt. We became servants of God. We replaced one slavery with another slavery. We are slaves unto HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Shimshon Raphael Hirsch explains that's why on Shavuot, the shtei halechem is allowed, or not allowed, is obligated to be brought of chametz, because the true freedom only took place on Shavuot when we accepted the Torah. So all year we have to remind ourselves we're servants of God. We're servants of God. So slave, matzah, 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 matzah. Shavuot, one day a year we can have the notion of freedom, and because ein lecha ben chorim ela misho sek b'Torah. It's the Torah that gives us our freedom, right? Without laws, without any discipline, you have anarchy. The Torah channels our desires into a positive direction, hopefully, and that can give us true freedom, and we know that the restrictions are what enable us to be free and can't do whatever you want in a democracy. So that's what Rav Shimshon Hirsch, that's how he explains it. Of course, you could say the same thing that you can say when you're in the Beit. In other words, you could argue on Rav Shimshon Hirsch also and say the opposite. That when you're in the Beit HaMikdash, you're demonstrating that you're a servant to God, and therefore you're allowed to eat chametz all year. But he limits it to Shavuot. In other words, it's very important that all year round we have to remind ourselves that we have to have the food of a slave, and just on Shavuot, he says the same thing. The bikurim, the dvash, which represents the notion of bikurim, that's our ticket to the land of Israel. Remember, it's the mikra bikurim. That's the farmer, the first fruits. The first fruits, which included wheat and barley. It wasn't until we think of fruit like apples and oranges from the Shivat Minim. So the farmer had to bring from the first of the Shivat Minim to the temple, beginning on Shavuot, and share it with the Kohen. And as I'm sure many of you know, that of course serves as the core text of the Pesach Seder. When the farmer brought the first fruit, he gave them to the Kohen, and he gave a brief synopsis of Jewish history. And he said, the way the Haggadah interprets it, a wandering Aramean was my father. Arami Oved Avi means, could mean Laban tried to destroy my father. Arami tried to destroy my father. But the way the Haggadah, or that's one way. And then that my ancestor Yaakov, he was wandering around. And then we go to Egypt and we're enslaved in Egypt. We cried out to God and God brought us into the land of Israel. And now, God, thank you for all this. We have this beautiful country, the beautiful produce of the land, and I'm going to share it now. These are the first of mine. The first is always special to somebody. I'm going to share it. We bring it to the Kohen, and we get to the Beit HaMikdash. So Rav Shimshon Hirsch says that same idea, that where there's the recognition of godliness, and God granted us the land of Israel, and that's our ticket. We have the land of Israel because we keep the mitzvot of the Torah. So therefore, on Shavuot, those two mitzvot, the two mitzvot of Shavuot, can be brought of chametz. Now, of course, the whole explanation of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is totally anachronistic, because I mentioned earlier that the Torah makes no mention of receiving the Torah on Shavuot. So obviously, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is going, which I assume this is how most Jews assume, that even though the Torah doesn't tell us, that's because every day we get the Torah. The Torah doesn't want to have a specific day for getting the Torah. Every day we receive the Torah, so to speak. And even though it's not explicit, but clearly that's behind what's going on in the Torah, or maybe even if it's not, that's historically, we celebrate Shavuot as Matan Toratenu. We know that in actual practice, first of all, the Torah we have today was given on Yom Kippur, was not given on Shavuot. The Torah of Shavuot was broken. Moshe Rabbeinu broke the tablets. Shiva Asar Tammuz, we needed a new covenant. That became on Yom Kippur. And but whatever it is, we today, I've mentioned this before. I think, Mordechai Breuer has a beautiful explanation, or a very fascinating explanation, that really it was after the destruction of the temple that the rabbis reinvented the holiday of Shavuot. That before the holiday of Shavuot, during the time of Israel was living in the land, so Shavuot was an agricultural holiday. The way it's described in the Torah, only agriculture. So it's only one day. The farmer can't take a week off in the middle of in the summer season, in the busy season. Shavuot was one day, agricultural festival. When the Jews were exiled from the land, the holiday had no meaning. There's nothing to hold on to. So the rabbis reinvented the holiday, so to speak, and they looked, and it's clear that the Torah was given around Shavuot. Maybe on Shavuot, there's a debate in the Talmud. Was it on Shavuot, the day before Shavuot, the day after Shavuot? So the rabbis kind of reinvented the holiday to give it meaning. And fine, so Rabbi Hirsch is working on that idea. Okay, so that's a little bit why the Torah prohibits the eating of or the bringing of chametz when the korban mincha. And the Gemara explains there are three prohibitions here: to bake it, to bake it together, to put it into shaping, and to bring it onto the altar. That you can violate the prohibition of chametz in the korban mincha in many, many ways. Okay, so the question is, what about the Corvantoda? So the Corvantoda, why can the Corvantoda say have chametz in it? We looked back. If you look here, so the Torah is very clear. The Torah tells us. The Torah tells us, going back here, al chalot lechem chametz yakriv korbano. It has to be brought on chametz. So, okay, so there are a few possibilities. Let's take a look what the Netziv has to say. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the great Rosh Yeshiva. I don't have that in English. In the Volozhin Yeshiva in the 19th century, I guess great-grandfather of Rabbi Soloveitchik, his granddaughter, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, married the Netziv's granddaughter. And that was on one side. And of course, the Netziv had two sons 48 years apart. His wife died, and then he married his niece, the Aruch HaShulchan's daughter. And she was 36 years younger than he was. And they thought she was, crazy. Why does she want to marry such an old man? He was in his 70s. He was in his early 70s, and she was in her mid 30s. And she said no to marry such a great Torah scholar. And they got married, and they had a son, Rav Meir. Berlin, who then Hebraicized his name to Bar Ilan, and Bar Ilan, he died, I believe, in 1946, something like that, and Bar Ilan University is named for the son of the Netziv. And the other son is Chaim, so the yeshiva Chaim Berlin was named for the other son. Chaim Berlin and Bar Ilan University, you can take your pick of where in the spectrum you might want this to down. But the Netziv was a great Rosh Yeshiva in the Volozhin Yeshiva for the last 39 years, and unlike almost every other Rosh Yeshiva, he believed in the study of Chumash in a serious way. What can I tell you? In Yeshivot, they studied only Gemara. They didn't even, the Lithuanian Yeshivot did not even study Halakha. Halakha was a secondary subject. They studied Gemara. That's it. And the Netziv gave a Parshat Shavua. He spoke on the Parshat Shavua every morning. Apparently, he gave a shiur in Parshat Shavua, and they got written up in his commentary. Anyways, that's just a little bit of background. He was a supporter of the Zionist movement. He died in 1893. Netziv died in 1893. Okay, so he says like this: Mashmud HaMikra, the Tachlit HaKorban, hu chalot lechem. So the Netziv points out something. Al korbanot lechem todah. It says like this. It sounds like the purpose of the tachlit korban hu chalot lechem chametz. The purpose of the korban is to have chametz. Why? So mishum hachi lechem chametz hu ikar. Al zevach todah shlomav. You should do it on the bread. Hu ikar mishum shehu zevach todah shlomav. So he says like this, Vinyan, why is this so? Whenever somebody has some miracle happen to him, I listened this morning, they interviewed somebody, some people live in Toronto, some dump driver truck picked up a car yesterday, literally, put his in the car, and he didn't notice, and he was dragging the car along the Gardner Expressway here in Toronto. The woman thought she was going to be killed. I heard her interview this morning on the radio, and somebody managed to wave down the guy and to thank God. So she was saying, thank God she's alive. So she would be obligated to bring a Corvantoda. She'd have to bring a Thanksgiving offering. So the purpose is to tell everybody to thank God that I'm alive. Mitam zeh ribakatu belechem. Because of this, that the reason is to give thank you, the Torah says bring 40 loaves of bread. Okay, some are chametz, some are matzah. And we have less time to eat it. If you noticed, a korban shlamim is normally eaten for 2 days. And you can eat it for 2 days. The Corvantoda can only be eaten for 1 day, unlike every other korban shlamim. Why? Says, no, you can only eat it for 1 day, so you got to invite a lot of friends. You bring a whole cow as a sacrifice. How are you going to eat that in 1 day? Can't have leftovers. We want you to invite a lot of people. Here we are going to celebrate the Suda Chad B'Yom HaKrava. So you only have 1 day. And so why am I you invite all your friends to a party. We're going to have a barbecue, and we're going to have lamb chops, whatever. We'll make it lamb, whatever. It's before Pesach. And we're going to tell everybody, why? What's going on here? Well, I just was saved. A great thing happened to me. I just got into medical school. I'm really excited. I want to say thanks to God. So Yesi Puranesh, the Firav Hanashim. So there are going to be a lot of people, Arba Chalot L'Kohanim, and then you give 1/10 to the Kohanim. Now this is in. So the main eating is the bread. Is chametz. The matzah hu lechem only. Who wants to eat cham? Who wants to eat matzah? Matzah is lousy. Matzah doesn't taste good. Chametz, the matzah hu lechem only. It's poor man's bread. It doesn't taste good. We're having a really, really nice meal. You want to have a meal of bread. That's what the Netziv says. So the korban todah, which is to thank God for what happened. You're very excited. You got to invite a lot of friends because you got to eat it quickly. And we're going to pack it on. We're going to say, not only do you bring an animal, we bring 40 loaves of bread. 40 loaves of bread. And by the way, even though there were 30 loaves of chametz, of matzah, and 10 of chametz, the actual flour was the same. We're going into all the details, but it was a lot. These are big loaves of bread. 20 loaves of bread. How many people do you have to invite to finish 20 loaves of bread in 1 day? You need 100 people at least, depending on how big the loaf is. You need a lot of people. So, but you want to have good food. You want to have chametz. So that of course begs the question. So why do we eat matzah to Seder. See, the biggest Corvantoda is the Korban Pesach. That Thanksgiving time, the Thanksgiving that we were saved, we were taken out of Egypt, we became a nation. The Korban Pesach is the Korban Todah par excellence. And interestingly enough, you have even less than 1 day to eat it. The normal shlamim is 2 days. The Korban Todah is 1 day. The Korban Pesach is half a day, not even half a day. It's a quarter of a day. Because normally you bring a korban, let's say a Tuesday, let's say you bring a korban this year, Korban Pesach on Shabbos. They brought the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. You bring the korban 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So you can eat it from the moment you bring it till the next day. You can eat it that day from when you bring it night. The Korban Pesach, you bring it, but I can't eat it yet. I got to wait till nighttime. And then I don't even have the whole night to eat it. I have to eat it by chatzot. I have to eat the Korban Pesach by chatzot. Whether that's a biblical law or a rabbinic law, it doesn't really matter. In actual practice, it matters, but not for our purposes. The Korban Todah, the Korban Pesach, therefore, is eaten for less time, and therefore you have to have a lot of people. You learn the Mishnayos in Masechet Pesachim. So, and it says in the Torah, Mimat Habayit, we say it's very unlikely one family can eat a whole lamb, even though they're not so big. It's not like eating a cow, but I imagine, I don't exactly know, I've never slaughtered a lamb, but you see, I imagine it takes a whole bunch of people. Remember, you have to eat it when you're full. You have to eat at the end of the meal. It's the dessert. You've already eaten. So how many people do you need to eat? And you're not allowed to have any leftovers. Torah prohibits you to have any leftovers. You have to have 100 people, whatever. You have to have a lot of people at the Pesach Seder to talk about the great miracles. The Korban Todah is a personal miracle. God forbid, the trunk driver, they said on the radio that had the police estimate, had the car gone, truck another few hundred meters, she was like on the rev, in Toronto, the gardener, he would have flipped the car over the railing, like down below, like that would have been it. So that's a Korban Todah on a personal level, but the Korban Pesach is on a national level. We're thanking God. So the question is, why then do we eat matzah? On Pesach, we should be eating chametz. And of course, if the whole idea is to celebrate our freedom, chametz, matzah is halach manya diachlu avatabar the mitzrayim. This is what the slaves ate. The free people don't eat matzah. I don't know, has anybody thought of this question before? Why the fanciest meal of the year? And Pesach is supposed to be the fanciest meal of the year. Why the fanciest meal of the year do we not serve nice bread? You go to a nice restaurant, right? They used to serve, they're opening up restaurants now a little bit. So they want to, you have nice bread and the fancy bread. So that's what we should have on Pesach. Anybody want to type in any ideas? Okay.
Appreciate our freedom.
Right. So the first reason could be because it's but it's interesting. We don't do it by the Corvantoda. We want to appreciate our freedom. But we have to say the most obvious things have to be said the most often. The most written commandment of the Torah is to be nice to strangers. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says that the Torah writes 36 times that you have to be nice to strangers because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then the Gemara says, and maybe 46 times. I sent out recently on one of the Daf Yomi pieces I wrote not too long ago, I quoted this Gemara. And when I first wrote about this in Bava Metzia, I actually put a footnote in what I wrote that I'm not aware of any list of the 36 times the Torah tells us to be nice. I know we read it here, but I don't see it 36 times in the Torah. So I want to know if there are any lists. So somebody wrote me, and then he went to work on it, and he published a little paper. It was published on the Sfarim blog of the possible 36, or Tosfot says, as Gemara says, maybe 46 times the Torah tells us to be nice to strangers because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So wherever it's in Torah, that's like over and over and over again. The Torah tells us that. So the Torah wants us to remember Egypt. The Torah, that we left Egypt, but we have to remember Egypt. So you want to say we have to remember what it's like to be a slave because we were slaves. So it's true. In theory, we shouldn't have any We should have at least chametz with the matzah, just like on the Corvantoda. We should really have chametz on Pesach night. That celebrates our freedom, along with the 4 cups of wine and the barbecued lamb and all the meat and everything, and the karpas, which wasn't meant as sad food to dip in salt water. The karpas was the appetizer to the fanciest meal of the year, right? So we should have chametz, but the Torah wants us to remind ourselves, to remind ourselves of what Egypt is like. So I just want to show you really a couple examples. They should be well known, but we don't pay attention to this so much. When we say we should remember what we did in Egypt, right? We have to recall the Egypt. So be nice to strangers. But that's only part of it. We know on Yom Kippur that the Torah reading in the afternoon is all about the sexual ethics, who you can and you can't marry. And the Torah introduces that pasuk by saying, do not act like the Egyptian country in which you dwelled. And clearly the Torah is telling us the sexual practices of the Egyptians we have to run away from. And here's another one, I guess, in a sense, my favorite as someone who worked, as an accountant previously. Lo tasu aval b'mishpat. You're not allowed to have any false measures. B'midah b'mishkal u'b'mishra, liquid, solid, doesn't matter. Moznei tzedek, avnei tzedek, epet tzedek, hin tzedek, yelachem. Tzedek, tzedek, justice, all kinds of honest balance, honest weights, honest ephah. Ephah is a measure of solid, and the hin is a measure of a liquid. I'm the Lord, the God who took you out of Egypt. So that's very nice. I should be honest in business because I should be honest in business. But the Torah tells us I should be honest in business because I took us out of Egypt, meaning the economic practices, the moral culture of how people conduct themselves in Egypt was inappropriate. And when we leave Egypt, we have to remember Egypt in order to not act like Egypt. So we have to remember the practices. That's what the matzah links us to the past. Now, Rashi here has it's like, if Rashi wouldn't have said it, I couldn't say it. Rashi's bothered, of course. What's the connection between having honest weights and I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt? Rashi says, Almanat Cain. That's why I took you out of Egypt. You know why God took us out of Egypt? To be honest in business. It's for this purpose, that you should be honest in your action. That's why God took us out of Egypt. To be honest, the culture of Egypt was dishonest, and it rubbed off on the Jews, right? So we have to act differently than the Egyptians, but we have to always remember what the Egyptians were, and that's why God took us out of Egypt. He didn't take us out of Egypt to eat matzah, to have a Pesach Seder, to, I don't know, all the ritual things we think of. I mean, maybe a little bit, but he didn't even take us out of Egypt to give us the Torah. You see, by the way, it's very fascinating. The giving of when the farmer makes his declaration and that we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out and he brought us to this land, he skips Mount Sinai. It's actually fascinating. I never really thought of it until this year. I was sort of studying it. And if you look in Mikra Bikurim, the parsha we use at the Seder, the farmer in the 6 verses, that 4 of which are quoted in this Haggadah, and 2 more which the farmer said, which are Haggadah that's not quoted, about coming to the land of Israel, because we're not in Israel, we weren't in Israel. So the farmer would say, he said nothing about going to Mount Sinai. It's actually a fascinating thing. In other words, the Torah, it's a given. I have to be honest, not because God gave us a Torah. I have to be honest because we were in Egypt, and God took us out of Egypt to be honest. And God, I don't need a Torah for all that, basically. So that's what. So we have to have the matzah because we've never left Egypt. And there's so many mitzvot of the Torah. Every other mitzvah we do, Kiddush on Friday night. I think mezuzah, tefillin, tzitzis, those are all the rituals. Pidyon haben, honesty in business, sexual ethics are all related to Zecher Lietziat Mitzrayim. We have no mitzvot in the Torah, Zecher Lemamad Har Sinai. There's no such concept. We don't have a concept to remember. We don't, as we mentioned earlier, we don't even know when the Torah was given. The Torah didn't interest the Torah. But what did interest the Torah is everything we do, and we have a mitzvah 365 days a year to remember the Exodus. So therefore, we have to. That's the simple reason why you have to eat matzah. We really shouldn't be eating matzah on Pesach. We should be eating chametz. The second reason, of course, and this is sort of a contradictory reason, all right, is we didn't want to have chametz. I mentioned this, I think, a number of weeks back, because bread was invented in Egypt. If you look, the art of bread making was Egyptian, and that's why I mentioned when Yosef and the brothers go down, when the brothers are there, the Egyptians won't eat bread. It's a toeva. It's an abomination for Egyptians to eat bread with non-Hebrew, to eat it with Hebrews. We only eat bread as a special Egyptian food. So bread is symbolized with Egypt. So on that sense, we have to break away from that, right? Always the dichotomy, the tension. We have to break away from Egypt on the one hand. So we can't have bread, because bread that's the materialism of Egypt. But we have to know what it's like. We have to learn from it. So we have to eat the matzah. That's and this actually reminded me of a more general question. This sort of idea of why were the Jewish people? Why was our nation formed in Egypt? Why couldn't we be formed in Canaan? God tells Avraham, go to the land that I'm going to show you, and Avraham goes, and he already went to Egypt already. He found come out. Well, why do I have to go this whole? Why do we have to go to Egypt for 400 years? So that's a big debate. Was it a punishment? Was it educational? We don't have time to get into. It's an important discussion. Of course, it's both. But that we had to go somewhere. The reason we had to go to Egypt is because Egypt was the most advanced country in the world, and the Torah wanted us to see the most advanced country in the world. You grow up, wanted to see how great we see science, technology, our architecture. We want to see that's the Jewish people have to learn from the greatest nation in the world. So we had to go to Egypt. If we grew up in some little Canaan was pastoral. There was no advancement. It was like a third world country. Egypt was a first world country. So God wanted the Jewish people to, we're a first world country. I don't mean it like the economic, I mean, we have to be leaders in the world. The Torah tells us in Sefer Dvarim that the nations of the world, you have to keep the Torah, so the nations of the world say, wow, what an amazing nation. What a great laws these Torah are. We're smart. And the Gemara says you have to study science because the nation should say we're smart people. So we had to go to Egypt because we had to experience and see the greatest civilization on earth. At the same time, the Torah is teaching us that the greatest scientific and technological civilization on earth can be the most morally depraved place on earth. And nobody in our time needs that lesson, but that's an important lesson of the Torah, that on the one hand, we should learn the great scientific achievements. On the other hand, that great nation can be sexually depraved, morally depraved, the way they treat immigrants, strangers, the way they treat people. So the two don't go hand in hand. The Torah wanted us to always remember that greatness in economics and greatness in science doesn't lead to greatness in morality. And we need the Torah to help us to have the greatest in morality. So that's why we've got to eat the matzah. That's why we're eating the matzah, to remind us of what Egypt was like, because it's such a fancy meal. It's the Corvantoda par excellence that has to be eaten dafka with chametz, because chametz is what people like. Who likes to eat matzah? It's not so good. I know the first night of, that's the reason we don't eat matzah. Some people don't eat matzah a month before. The Gemara practice is only one day before. Why? Because if you ate matzah the week leading up to Pesach, you'll be sick of matzah already. We want at least at the Seder, you shouldn't be sick of matzah. At least at the Seder, this is really good. But within a couple of days, we lose all that. Anyways, with that, and that reminded me, I just wanted to share with you another beautiful idea of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. That is sort of the idea of growing up and seeing greatness. It's interesting. So, and I looked for it. So I went on Sefaria. So I was quite impressed and disappointed that in Sefaria they only have Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in German. So for those who know German, they got it in the original. That's great. So I couldn't find, I have it in English here on my counter, but I could only find it online in Hebrew. But I just wanted to read this very, very briefly, and then I have hopefully a couple of points I can get to. He's talking about why Avraham moves to Gerar. Right after Sodom is destroyed, the Torah tells us that Avraham moved to Gerar. Why? So he says like this. Bidu me'idach, hamanea mehanar kol maki menashim achoshvim acheret. To deprive children, he was living in Elon Mamre, a little hick town. That's the way he's presented. 18 people. There were no great universities there. To deprive a child in any contact with people who think differently, whose lifestyle is very different. That's a dangerous educational thing, mistake. To have kids only go to school with kids from similar background, that's a dangerous educational error. You must have see people whose lifestyle is different than theirs. A young person who never saw anybody live differently than his parents. He can never compare different lifestyles. This one does it. It's not religious. Yes, religious. Reform, humanist, whatever. Who never learned to evaluate and to harich at hanigud, the differences between different cultures and different ways of life. He'll never begin to appreciate what his parents have taught him, how important it is. He has to see it in practice. Has to see what it's compared to, what other people do. But daihu, for sure, yeah, you can keep them in the ghetto, but as soon as they go out of the ghetto, they won't be able to survive. They won't be able to withstand the outside influences, which is why they don't want them to have any influences. Obviously, Shinshrim first, modern, founder of Torah in Derech Eretz. But I just find Kederech Shehayarei Mehavir the person who's afraid of the cold and he sits in his room, the moment he goes outside, you need, quote unquote, a vaccine. You need to have a little bit to taste what the other side says. I just think that's a very powerful lesson. Pesach is all about chinuch and the different children at the Seder, the Chacham, the Rasha, Tam Sheno, the Shol. Those are just models. And it's very important. It's very important to have a Seder with people who are different. And the Jewish people had to see Egypt because Egypt was different. They were in Canaan. They wouldn't have learned from that. So I think that's a very powerful, very beautiful idea. Just in the couple minutes we have left, I really wanted to say one thing about the Korban Pesach and Chag HaMatzot. You know that it's not really Chag HaPesach. If you look in the Torah, Chag HaPesach is the 14th of Nisan. Chag HaMatzot is on the 15th of Nisan. So you can see that right in the Torah. B'chodesh Rishon, B'arba'asar l'chodesh, Pesach l'Hashem. Pesach is the 14th. U'b'chamishasar yom l'chodesh is that. But on the 15th, it's Chag HaMatzot. Shivat Yamim Matzot Tochelu. Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot are two different holidays. They're connected. Now, when do Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaPesach connect? And I apologize if I'll go a minute over time. Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaSukkot interact on the 6 hours between when it gets dark on Saturday night until midnight, until Chatzot. What do I mean like that? So, see, in the temple, everybody knows a Jewish day starts at night. Everybody from the time they're 3 years to 2 years old knows a Jewish day starts at night. We start Shabbos Friday night, Pesach starts Saturday night, everything starts at night. But that's only half true. In the Beit HaMikdash, the day started in the morning. And that's why when I said you bring a Korban Pesach, when you bring a Korban for 2 days or 1 day, means if, let's say, bring it on Monday afternoon at 11 o'clock in the morning, so I can eat it Monday all day, and Monday night all night, and Tuesday morning I have to stop. The day ends on Tuesday morning. And then on a Korban Shlamim, I get that extra day. I get Tuesday till Tuesday night, 2 days and 1 night, whatever. Two extra, but it's a day begins. That's how we think. I mean, the idea that we start the day at night doesn't make any sense. We live our whole life by starting the day in the morning. All the brachot we say to thank God that we can, the brachot hashachar, we all say it in the morning. Like, it's weird to start the day, you're sort of at work and it gets dark and it's a new day. It makes much more sense to start the day in the morning. And that's exactly why in the Beit HaMikdash it did. Now, why does the day start at night? So very briefly, because I think like this is our form of imitating God. What happens in the beginning of Torah? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. It's complete darkness. The world begins with darkness, and then vayihi or, and God creates light. The mandate of man is to imitate God. That's what we were put on this earth for. The 13 midot, v'alachta b'drachav, walk in the path of God. So we have a world of darkness, and we must bring light to this world. So the day begins with darkness, just how the Torah began at darkness. And then our mission is vayihi or. Our mission is during that nighttime to figure out how we're going to bring light to the world, figuratively. The temple is a place of light. The temple that's the place where the divine presence rests. So therefore, the day can start when it should normally start. The day should start in the morning because that's the place. So on Pesach night, when we eat the Korban Pesach, it's still Chag HaPesach because the 14th from the temple time still goes through the night and through the 15th, and then but it's Chag HaMatzot already started. So Chag HaMatzot and Chag HaPesach join together at night, and I think that's the deeper meaning behind the last one of the songs we say, Vayihi b'chatzi halayla, all the miracles that happen at night, because night is the symbol of fear and day is the symbol of hope. And Pesach is the time, the Torah in Parshat Rei says we left Egypt at night, balayla. Pesach is transforming the night into day, and that's what the last paragraph, Karev Yom Asher Hu Lo Yom V'Lo Laila. Some will have the day, the Messianic era, where the night, it won't be day or night, it'll be all light. So that's really what Chag HaPesach, that's the mission of the Jew, to turn night into day. But the Korban Pesach is sort of when we achieve that. So that's a few thoughts. Just basically, Parshat Tzav talks about the Corvantoda. That's what Pesach is all about. That's what our life has to be all about. Gratitude, giving, Thanksgiving. And so how do we give Thanksgiving to God? Through matzah or chametz. So that's the tension we have. The korbanot mincha generally have to be chametz because it represents either we should be humble, represents how quickly we have to work, all of ideas. And then there are exceptions to the rule. The Corvantoda, where we're giving Thanksgiving, or we understand that. It's Shavuot, and we understand that we are subservient to God and we work for God. We've accepted the Torah. So those times are exceptions to the rule that can be turned into chametz. And then the highest level of the Corvantoda is we want to publicize the miracle. It's basically marketing. The Corvantoda is the beginning of marketing in the Torah. Something good happens, invite people to a party. You don't have so long, you just have a little bit of time. Korban's to Seder night, you only have a few hours, and you got to get a lot of people, a lot to eat. So you got to get a lot of people, can't have any leftovers. So that's we should all be blessed with a Pesach where we can see the light. I think hopefully the light at the end of the tunnel. It's been a long, dark year. For some people, a horrendous year. It's been for everybody a difficult year. And we should see the light at the end of the tunnel, to please God. And hopefully by Shavuot, forget next Pesach, by Shavuot, we shall be back normal. So I want to wish everybody, I really want to thank you like that. You all can come on Erev Pesach. I greatly appreciate it. If people are interested, we can have a shir next Thursday night. If people would like, just let me know. If one or two people say yes, we'll give a shir. Otherwise, Benny Gesundheit is giving the shir. That's not fair. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. But Benny Gesundheit will be giving us the Tehillim shir on Tuesday. And anyways, thank you very much. I want to wish everybody a wonderful Pesach. We will be continuing. Follow your emails. I guess over Chol HaMoed, we'll probably announce our post-Pesach programs. Please God, I will start with Pirkei Avot again on Friday mornings. After Pesach, like we did last year, we'll pick up in the end of the third parak at Friday morning Pirkei Avot. And anyways, everybody should be well. Chag Sameach v'Kasher, and we should be humble and bring light, much light into the world. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Jay.
Yes.
When do we revatal the chametz? Friday morning or Saturday morning?
Saturday morning, both. I mean, after tonight, bitul chametz, and then on Saturday morning. You don't do it when you burn the chametz tomorrow. You do it on Saturday morning.
That's what I was wondering, yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
I think Toronto's what, 11:17 or something is the last time we can eat. You know, I have to check the exact time.
Well, that's eating.
Yeah, I'm talking E, right? The burning is about 12:20 or so.
Right.
Yeah. But
Okay.
yes.
Do you say Mizmor L'Todah tomorrow or not?
So yes, I assume. Thank you. I mentioned at the beginning we don't say it Erev Pesach, and then I stopped myself because this year the reason we don't say it Erev Pesach because it's made of chametz and you can eat it for one whole day till the next day. That's you can eat it on Erev Pesach, so you don't say it Erev Pesach. But being that you can eat it tomorrow, so I'm 99% sure you say it. Lodge. I didn't check the theater, but yeah, you're.
Yes, we
Okay,
do.
thank you.
Yeah, we'll say it tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the
Thank
best.
you.
Hashem v'sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you very much.
Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. All the
Shabbat
best.
Shalom. Yes, 3-day Yontif. I was talking to a friend of mine in Israel. She asked me if I'm getting you ready for a long Yontif. I said, we have them all the time here. You know the way our calendar works, we never go a complete year without a 3-day Yontif. It's impossible for Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, none of them to be a 3-day Yontif. The way that, you know, with Lo Adu Rosh and that, we always have one 3-day Yontif a year. Like sometimes we have 3 Rosh Hashanah. Anyways, okay.
All the best.
Yeah, be well, everybody. Thank you.